Late afternoon, May 1945. Okinawa. Rain drifts sideways across the Maeda Escarpment, turning coral dust into grey paste. Smoke hangs low, clinging to the cliff face like a shroud. Below the ridge, the sea is invisible, hidden behind fire and cloud. Above it, the ground trembles with artillery impacts that come without warning. American infantrymen pull back from the edge. Some crawl, some run, some are carried. Orders have been given. The ridge is lost, for now. But not everyone leaves. Near the cliff's edge, a single figure moves against the current. No rifle, no helmet insignia marking rank, just a medic's red cross, smeared with mud and blood. He kneels beside a wounded soldier, checks for breath, applies a bandage with hands that will not stop shaking. Enemy fire cracks overhead. Shrapnel snaps into stone. The wounded man cannot walk. The medic does not hesitate. He drags him to the edge, ties a rope, lowers the body into smoke and darkness below. Then he turns back toward the ridge, alone, searching for the next voice calling for help. By nightfall, no one will know how many times he does this, only that he never stopped. To understand how this moment came to exist, the world beyond this ridge must be seen first. By the spring of 1945, the Second World War had reached its most violent and unforgiving phase in the Pacific. Germany was collapsing in Europe, but against Imperial Japan, the war showed no sign of restraint. Each island taken had demanded blood. Each mile forward had been paid for with lives. American strategy now pointed toward a final objective that few spoke about openly, but all understood. The Japanese home islands. To reach them, the United States needed Okinawa. Okinawa was not just another island. It was the largest of the Ryukyu chain, sitting less than 350 miles from Kyushu. Its airfields could host heavy bombers. Its harbors could support the largest invasion fleet ever assembled. If Okinawa fell, Japan itself would be within direct, sustained reach. Operation Iceberg began on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. Nearly 1,300 American ships filled the waters around the island. Over 180,000 US troops would eventually be committed. Facing them was Japan's 32nd Army, roughly 100,000 men, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. But unlike earlier island battles, the Japanese did not plan to fight on the beaches. They let the Americans land. The opening assault was eerily quiet. No massed counterattacks, no banzai charges. For days, US forces advanced inland with minimal resistance. Some commanders feared a trap. They were right. The Japanese had learned, from Tarawa, from Saipan, from Peleliu. They abandoned costly beach defenses and instead transformed Okinawa's southern ridges into a fortress. Caves, tunnels, interlocking fields of fire, artillery hidden deep underground, immune to bombardment. At the center of this defensive system lay a jagged limestone escarpment running east to west across the island. The Americans would come to call it Hacksaw Ridge. Officially, it was the Maeda Escarpment. It rose abruptly from the surrounding terrain, nearly 400 feet of sheer cliff in places. Above it, the Japanese had carved firing positions into rock. Below it, any assaulting force would be exposed, climbing ropes and cargo nets under direct observation. Taking the escarpment was essential. Without it, American forces could not advance south toward Shuri, the heart of Japanese defenses. Repeated assaults followed, day after day. Infantry attacks supported by tanks and flamethrowers, artillery barrages that shook the island itself. Yet the ridge held. The fighting here bore little resemblance to maneuver warfare. It was close, brutal, personal. Men fought for yards, sometimes inches. Visibility was often reduced to smoke and rain. Casualties mounted rapidly. Medics worked constantly, moving from crater to crater, from shattered bodies to the barely breathing. They carried no weapons. Under the Geneva Convention, they were non-combatants. In practice, that protection meant little. Snipers targeted them. Mortars fell indiscriminately. Explosions buried the wounded alive. By May, units rotated in and out of the line already exhausted. The 77th and 96th Infantry Divisions bore much of the fighting. Reinforcements arrived already depleted by disease, shell shock, and weeks of combat elsewhere on the island. It was into this environment that one US Army medic operated, not as an exception to the chaos, but fully within it. He carried the same medical kit as the others. He wore the same mud-stained uniform. He endured the same shell fire. But his presence on the ridge carried a quiet distinction, one that would only fully reveal itself when the battle reached its breaking point. Because as the struggle for Okinawa tightened around the Maeda Escarpment, the choices made there would no longer be collective. They would become individual and irreversible. The story now narrows, from the movement of armies to the ground beneath a single man's boots. The American units tasked with taking the Maeda Escarpment were experienced, but experience offered no immunity here. The 77th Infantry Division, a reserve formation activated after Pearl Harbor, had already fought in Guam. The 96th Infantry Division had seen action at Leyte. Both divisions understood jungle warfare. Neither had faced terrain quite like this. Okinawa was a labyrinth. Its limestone ridges were honeycombed with caves, many invisible until they opened fire. Rain turned the ground into a slick of mud and pulverized coral. Movement was slow. Evacuation of wounded was slower still. In many areas, vehicles were useless. Casualties had to be carried by hand. Japanese defensive doctrine on Okinawa was designed to maximize this suffering. Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Isamu Cho, rejected mass charges. Instead, they relied on delay and attrition. American units would be allowed to advance, then cut apart by concealed positions. Every hill became a killing zone. Every night brought infiltration and counterattacks. The Maeda Escarpment embodied this strategy perfectly. Japanese defenders controlled the high ground, and they used it relentlessly. Mortars were pre-registered. Machine guns overlapped. Snipers waited for medics. By early May, American assaults began to falter. Companies that had gone up the ridge with over 200 men came back with fewer than half. Replacement soldiers arrived with minimal training. Fatigue became constant. So did fear. It was here that Private First Class Desmond Thomas Doss served as a combat medic with Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division. Doss was not unknown to his unit. Long before Okinawa, he had distinguished himself by refusing to carry a weapon. A Seventh-day Adventist, he held a strict interpretation of the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." He enlisted anyway, believing his duty was to save life, not take it. This choice had followed him since training. He had faced ridicule, disciplinary threats, court-martial proceedings that ultimately failed because he violated no regulation. By the time he reached Okinawa, many in his company had already revised their opinions, not because of belief, but because of performance. Under fire, Doss did not hesitate. He crawled forward when others fell back. He treated wounds in open ground. He stayed until the last casualty was stabilized. He was wounded himself on multiple occasions, but refused evacuation. These facts were recorded not as legend, but in after-action reports and sworn testimony. Still, nothing separated him from the rest of the medics on the ridge. All faced the same risks. All worked under the same conditions. The difference would only become clear when the ridge itself became untenable. On May 5th, a major assault gained temporary ground on top of the escarpment. For several days, American troops held a precarious position. Then, on May 12th, the Japanese counterattacked in force. Smoke, artillery, and close-quarters combat erupted along the crest. Communications broke down. Units became intermingled. The situation dissolved into chaos. By late afternoon, orders were issued to withdraw from the ridge. The position could not be held, not yet. The wounded were to be evacuated if possible. Those who could move would move. Those who could not would be assisted as time allowed. Time, however, was running out. As companies pulled back toward the cliff edge, they left behind men who could not walk. Some were unconscious, some were bleeding out, some were trapped in shell holes as fire swept across the ridge. This was the moment when the battle ceased to be about territory. It became about choice. As the last organized elements of Company B began to descend the escarpment, one medic remained on the top. Not because he was ordered to, not because anyone asked him to. He stayed because voices were still calling for help. And the ridge had not finished demanding its price. On the ridge, survival narrowed to minutes, sometimes seconds. A man hit by shrapnel could bleed out before help arrived. A chest wound could collapse a lung while artillery still fell. For the wounded, time slowed. For the medic, it accelerated. Desmond Doss moved through this environment without a weapon, but not without fear. Fear was constant on Okinawa. Veterans later testified that anyone who claimed otherwise did not belong there. The difference lay in what fear controlled and what it did not. Doss treated wounds while exposed. He crawled forward under fire not because he was immune to danger, but because he understood the cost of delay. Each decision carried weight. Who could be saved first? Who had a chance? Who did not? He carried men heavier than himself across broken ground. He worked through tremors caused by exhaustion and adrenaline. At times, his hands cramped so severely he had to force them open to continue bandaging. This was not heroism in abstraction. It was labor, repetitive, physically punishing, emotionally draining, and it continued long after the limits of endurance had been reached. Doss's refusal to carry a weapon had once isolated him. On the ridge, it defined him. He believed killing was wrong under any circumstance. Yet he chose to fight a war by stepping directly into its violence. His moral code did not shield him from bloodshed. It placed him in the center of it. He treated enemy wounded when they were found. He did not distinguish beyond urgency and survivability. In the chaos of Okinawa, where hatred had been fueled by years of brutal fighting, this stance was not common, but it was consistent, and consistency mattered. Fellow soldiers began to rely on him, not for ideology, but for certainty. They knew he would come. Extended combat eroded judgment. Men became numb. Others broke suddenly. Okinawa saw more cases of combat exhaustion than any previous Pacific battle. Medics absorbed this strain twice over. They carried their own fear and the fear of those they treated. They heard last words. They watched men die after doing everything correctly. For Doss, the psychological burden compounded with isolation. When units withdrew, medics often withdrew last. On the Maeda Escarpment, one did not withdraw at all. As darkness approached, the ridge grew quieter, not safer. The voices calling for help were fewer now. Each one stood out more sharply. It was in this narrowing space, between remaining strength and remaining time, that the battle revealed its most severe test. And that test was not yet complete. On paper, casualty evacuation followed doctrine. In practice, Okinawa shattered it. Stretcher teams were exposed, routes changed by the hour. Smoke and shellfire erased landmarks. At the Maeda Escarpment, evacuation routes ended at a cliff. When American forces occupied the ridge, supplies and men were hauled up using cargo nets and ropes. When they withdrew, the same vertical drop became the only way down. Wounded men who could walk descended on their own. Those who could not were lowered by hand, if time allowed. Under fire, this process slowed to a crawl. Doss adapted without instruction. He tied improvised harnesses. He used a simple knot to control descent. One man at a time, lowered through smoke. Released. Rope hauled back. Repeated. There was no system beyond what worked. No protection beyond the cliff itself. Each lowering exposed him again. To observation. To snipers. To mortar bursts that struck the ridge with mathematical regularity. Yet the process continued because it was the only option left. Command decisions on Okinawa were shaped by attrition. Units were committed, withdrawn, and recommitted in cycles designed to grind down Japanese defenses. At the company level, leadership often meant keeping men moving forward under conditions that offered little hope. The withdrawal from the escarpment was not a failure of will, it was a calculation. Holding the ridge without adequate support would have meant annihilation. Once the order came down, leaders focused on extracting as many men as possible. They could not account for every individual. They could not remain to supervise every evacuation. That gap between command intent and execution was where individual action mattered most. Doss did not act outside orders. He acted beyond their reach. Afterward, officers would struggle to quantify what he had done. Numbers varied. Estimates ranged from 50 to over 100 wounded evacuated. The exact figure was never confirmed. What was confirmed was the absence of men who would otherwise have been left behind. Leadership noticed when those men reappeared at aid stations below the ridge. Japanese forces on the escarpment were not passive observers. They were skilled, disciplined, and determined. They targeted medics deliberately, knowing the effect their loss would have on morale and survival. As night approached, Japanese soldiers moved through tunnels to reposition. Some emerged behind American lines. Others waited for silhouettes against the skyline. Doss was visible. Each time he approached the cliff, he exposed himself. That he was not killed remains a matter of probability, not mysticism. Bullets missed. Shells landed elsewhere. Smoke obscured him at critical moments. This was not because the enemy failed to act. It was because combat is not absolute. Even in the most lethal environments, chance still governs outcomes. For those lowered from the ridge, survival came with memory. Many would later testify that they assumed they were being left behind. That realization carried a finality few could describe. To feel the rope tighten, to begin descending, to realize someone had stayed. That knowledge endured long after Okinawa. For Doss, survival carried no sense of triumph. He did not know how many men he had saved. He only knew when the voices stopped, when exhaustion finally overcame him, when there was no one left to answer. By the time he descended the escarpment himself, night had fully fallen. The ridge was quiet, not because the battle had ended, but because it had paused. The next assault would come, and with it, a moment that would permanently mark the course of the battle. The ridge did not remain silent for long. By mid-May 1945, the battle for the Maeda Escarpment resumed with renewed urgency. Commanders understood its importance now with painful clarity. Without control of the ridge, further advance toward Shuri, the backbone of Japanese defenses, was impossible. Artillery was repositioned. Fresh units were rotated forward. The assault would begin again. On May 21st, American forces returned to the base of the escarpment. The weather had worsened. Rain fell in sheets, soaking uniforms and weapons alike. Mud clung to boots. Smoke from preparatory bombardments rolled back down the slopes, obscuring everything. The climb was as deadly as before. As infantry units fought, their way upward, Japanese defenders opened fire from concealed positions. Mortars bracketed approach routes. Machine guns swept the ridgeline. Casualties accumulated rapidly, often within minutes of contact. Desmond Doss climbed with them. He moved from man to man, ignoring the slope, the incoming fire, the screams. When a soldier went down, Doss went with him. He treated wounds in place, applied morphine, stopped bleeding with whatever he had left in his kit. When evacuation was possible, he assisted. When it was not, he stayed. By afternoon, the American assault stalled again near the crest. Units dug in where they could. The Japanese countered with artillery and infiltration. The ridge became a patchwork of isolated positions. Then, without warning, Japanese forces launched a concentrated counterattack. Smoke grenades burst along the line. Enemy soldiers emerged from hidden tunnels behind American positions. Close-quarters combat erupted. Grenades exploded at arm's length. Rifles became clubs. In the confusion, American lines fractured. Once more, the order came to withdraw. The message passed unevenly. Some units heard it immediately. Others did not. Small groups fought on, unaware that the ridge was being abandoned again. The wounded multiplied as fire intensified. As soldiers began pulling back toward the cliff edge, the same reality returned. Not everyone could move. Doss found himself surrounded by wounded men, some conscious, some not. The path downward was already congested. Artillery continued to fall. Japanese fire followed movement relentlessly. He did not follow the others. Instead, he dragged the nearest wounded man toward the edge, secured the rope, lowered him into the smoke below. He whispered a prayer, not for safety, but for time. Then he turned back. Each return trip across the ridge exposed him again. Each minute increased the risk that he would be spotted. At one point, shrapnel tore into his leg. He bandaged it himself and continued working. Darkness began to fall. As visibility dropped, the danger did not. Japanese troops moved through the darkness with ease, using their tunnels and pre-planned routes. Sporadic gunfire echoed across the ridge. Occasional flares illuminated the landscape in stark white flashes. Doss kept moving. He counted no rescues. He measured progress only by the absence of voices. When he heard one, he went toward it. When he did not, he searched. At some point during the night, a grenade exploded near him, sending fragments into his body. He was wounded again, more severely this time. Still, he refused evacuation. Hours passed. When the ridge finally went quiet again, it was not because the fighting had ended. It was because there was no one left to help. Only then did Doss descend the escarpment himself, his uniform shredded, his body barely holding together. What happened next would carry his actions beyond the ridge and into the permanent record of the war. At dawn, the ridge was inspected. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Equipment was scattered across the crest. Shell holes marked the ground like open wounds. Officers moved carefully, expecting renewed fire at any moment. What they did not expect was the absence of missing men. Reports began to circulate quietly at first. Men thought lost during the withdrawal had appeared at aid stations below the escarpment. Some arrived late in the night. Others were discovered at first light. All told the same story, though none could explain it fully. A medic had stayed behind. As the fighting continued elsewhere along the line, word spread through the regiment. It moved not as rumor, but as confirmation. Names were checked, roles were compared. The number of wounded who should have been unaccounted for did not match the reality on the ground. Estimates varied. In sworn statements later submitted by officers and enlisted men alike, the number of wounded evacuated by Doss that night ranged from 50 to over 100. Doss himself would later say he believed it was closer to 50. Commanders, reviewing the situation afterward, estimated closer to 75. The exact number mattered less than the outcome. Those men were alive. Doss was finally evacuated, not for his actions on the ridge, but because his injuries could no longer be ignored. He was carried on a litter toward a dressing station. Even then, he insisted on giving up the stretcher to another wounded man more seriously hurt. When ordered to stay put, he complied. Minutes later, he was hit again by a sniper's bullet, fracturing his arm. This time, he could not continue. As he was moved rearward, American forces reorganized. The ridge would be assaulted again days later and eventually taken. The Japanese defenses at Shuri would begin to collapse. Okinawa would fall after weeks more of brutal fighting. But what happened on the Maeda Escarpment during that withdrawal did not fade with the advance. Officers documented it. Medics testified to it. Infantrymen who had once doubted Doss spoke openly of what they had seen, or what they had survived because of him. When recommendations for Valor Awards were submitted, there was no debate over whether his actions qualified. The only question was how to describe them without exaggeration. In October 1945, Desmond Thomas Doss received the Medal of Honor from President Harry S. Truman. He was the first conscientious objector to receive the award. The citation did not mention faith. It did not mention belief. It listed actions, dates, locations. It described a man who repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to save the wounded, refusing to abandon them even when wounded himself. For those who had been on the ridge, the citation read less like recognition and more like record-keeping. It confirmed what they already knew. The Battle for Okinawa would claim over 12,000 American lives and more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers. Civilians suffered in numbers impossible to fully account for. The island was left shattered. Yet within that destruction, one moment remained intact. A single medic, a cliff edge, and the refusal to leave. What followed would shape not only memory, but understanding. The battle for Okinawa did not end with the securing of the Maeda Escarpment. It ground on for weeks, consuming men, equipment, and resolve with relentless efficiency. When organized Japanese resistance finally collapsed in late June 1945, the island had become one of the bloodiest battlegrounds in American military history. The numbers told part of the story. More than 49,000 American casualties, including over 12,000 dead. Japanese military losses exceeded 100,000. Civilian deaths, caught between entrenched defenses and overwhelming firepower, likely numbered in the tens of thousands. For those who had fought on the ridge, these figures were not abstractions. They had faces, names, voices that no longer answered. Within Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, the impact of what had happened during the withdrawals from Hacksaw Ridge became clear only after time had passed. Men who had assumed they would be listed as missing were not. Wounded soldiers who believed their survival improbable rejoined their units months later, some still bearing the marks of the ridge. The psychological effect was profound. Soldiers who had once regarded medics as auxiliary personnel began to see them differently. Trust deepened, not because of doctrine, but because of lived experience. When Doss was evacuated, his absence was felt immediately. Other medics filled the role, but none replaced the certainty his presence had provided. Leadership too took note. Reports emphasized not just bravery, but persistence. Doss had not acted in a single moment of impulse. He had sustained effort under fire for hours, without supervision, without reinforcement, and without expectation of recognition. This distinction mattered. In the months following Okinawa, as units rotated home or prepared for further operations, stories from the ridge spread beyond the 77th Infantry Division. They moved through hospitals, through training camps, through families receiving letters that described survival against all odds. Yet the aftermath for Doss himself was quieter. He spent years recovering from his wounds. His left arm remained impaired. Shrapnel fragments stayed lodged in his body for the rest of his life. He suffered from tuberculosis contracted during the war, likely exacerbated by the conditions under which he served. Recognition did not translate into ease. What it did translate into was permanence. His actions entered the historical record not as legend, but as testimony corroborated by those who had been there. And as the war ended, and the world began to reckon with its cost, that record would take on new meaning, beyond medals, beyond individual heroism. It would become a point of reflection. In the years after the war, official accounts of Okinawa focused on strategy, scale, and outcome. Maps showed arrows moving south. Reports measured success in captured terrain and neutralized divisions. But beneath those summaries, individual actions like those on the Maeda Escarpment remained embedded in unit histories and personal memory. Desmond Doss did not seek to shape that narrative. He returned to civilian life quietly, working when his health allowed, living with injuries that never fully healed. He spoke of the war rarely, and when he did, he avoided framing his actions as extraordinary. He described them as necessary. The Medal of Honor citation followed him regardless. It placed him in a category reserved for those whose actions exceeded the bounds of duty under direct enemy fire. For many, it also challenged assumptions about courage and combat. Doss was a conscientious objector, but not a pacifist removed from violence. He served on the front line. He endured the same conditions. He accepted the same risks. His refusal to carry a weapon did not remove him from the battlefield. It placed him deeper within it. For the US military, this distinction mattered. His award affirmed that valor was not limited to those who fired weapons. It broadened the definition of service without altering the realities of war. Veterans of the 77th Infantry Division would later reflect that his presence had changed unit morale. Knowing that someone would come for the wounded altered how men advanced, how they held positions, how they endured fear. This was not sentimentality. It was practical psychology. On Okinawa, survival often depended on belief that wounds would be treated, that evacuation was possible, that being hit did not mean being abandoned. Doss reinforced that belief through action. Historians examining the battle would note that medics on Okinawa suffered casualty rates nearly equal to those of riflemen. They worked unarmed in environments designed to maximize exposure. Their contributions rarely shifted front lines, but they preserved fighting strength in ways no map could show. The Maeda Escarpment eventually fell. The Japanese defensive line collapsed. The war moved closer to its conclusion. But the legacy of that ridge did not lie only in its capture. It lay in what it revealed about the human dimension of warfare, about choice under pressure, about endurance beyond expectation, and about the quiet labor that sustains armies long enough for strategy to succeed. As decades passed, that understanding would outlast the battle itself. All that remained was to ask what it meant. On Okinawa, victory came slowly, and at a cost few could comprehend while it was being paid. The island was secured. The strategic objectives were met. Airfields were built. Harbors opened. The machinery of war moved forward. But beneath those outcomes lay moments that could never be plotted on a map. On the Maeda Escarpment, the war reduced itself to its most basic elements: wounded men, falling night, and a single decision repeated again and again: to stay, to move toward danger instead of away from it, not once, but for hours, until strength was gone and silence remained. Desmond Doss did not change the course of the Pacific War. Okinawa would have fallen with or without him. That truth matters. History demands it. What he changed was smaller and therefore harder to dismiss. He altered the fate of dozens of men whose lives did not end on a ridge in 1945. Men who returned home, who remembered the sound of a rope tightening, who understood survival as something given by another human being, not by chance alone. In a war defined by overwhelming force, his actions demonstrated restraint without withdrawal, conviction without detachment, and courage without violence. They did not contradict the reality of war. They existed fully inside it. Hacksaw Ridge no longer echoes with gunfire. The escarpment stands quiet now, its scars softened by time. Yet what occurred there remains undiminished by distance, because history is not only shaped by those who advance lines or command armies. Sometimes it is shaped by one person who refuses to leave.